They said she was just a medic, just a patch-up girl with steady hands and no business in command. The kind of person you called when blood ran too fast, but never when bullets flew too close. And that was all she was supposed to be, until the night a captain, broken and bleeding in the dirt, raised his head and shouted a call sign no one else knew. 3 words that would change everything. Tiger Wolf, lead the evac. Before we dive into that moment, if you believe the quiet ones who save lives behind the scenes deserve just as much honor as those who hold the rifles, make sure to like and subscribe, because Elena Vargas's story will remind you that sometimes the fiercest warriors are the ones no one ever expected. She was 27, younger than most of the soldiers she treated, but already old in the ways that war makes people old. Her eyes carrying that restless watchfulness of someone who had seen pain up close and decided, stubbornly, not to look away. Elena worked out of the Forward Operating Base Clinic, a squat prefab building that smelled of antiseptic and diesel fuel, the kind of place where daylight rarely reached and laughter died quick. She patched men up in silence. Bullet grazes, torn ligaments, heat stroke, shrapnel. She wasn't glamorous, she wasn't loud, and that was enough for many of the infantry boys to dismiss her. To them, she was useful but forgettable, a background presence with a stethoscope instead of a rifle, someone who washed out blood, but not someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder with them when it mattered. They called her Doc sometimes, but more often it was Band-Aid or Patch, tossed with a grin, a nudge, a laugh. She never flinched at the names. She simply kept working, her hands steady, her focus sharp, her voice quiet but firm. And yet in every dismissive chuckle, in every rolled eye, in every muttered, "She's not really one of us," Elena carried the weight of silence, not weakness but memory, because long before she came to this dusty outpost, she had been called something else. Still, she didn't speak of it. She didn't correct the jokes or the ignorance. She kept her head down, her hair tied back in that messy bun that always slipped loose by the end of a 14-hour shift, and she moved through the base like a shadow. Morning began with the ritual inventory of gauze, syringes, for bags, and morphine doses, followed by endless hours of wrapping wounds, changing dressings, and writing neat notes no one read unless something went wrong. When the patrols rolled out, she prayed under her breath for them to come back intact. When they didn't, she worked until her knuckles cracked, pressing chest seals and cutting fatigues away with scissors, listening to the gasps, the curses, the whispered, "Tell my mom I'm sorry," that lingered long after the bleeding stopped. She never asked for thanks. She never demanded recognition. She simply kept saving whoever landed on her table. But the soldiers noticed other things, or rather, they noticed what she lacked. She didn't march in drills, didn't carry an M4, didn't bark orders, didn't sling the language of combat like the rest of them. And so the gap grew, subtle but sharp, the sense that Elena Vargas was necessary but not equal. There was one lieutenant, sharp-jawed and quick to sneer, who once said loudly at the chow hall, "She fixes sprained ankles. That doesn't make her a warrior." Laughter had followed, brittle and careless. Elena hadn't even looked up from her tray of rice and beans. She simply kept eating, though inside her chest something stirred. Not anger, not shame, but a reminder of a night long ago when no one had laughed as she carried men on her back through fire. But that was a story no one here knew, and she intended to keep it that way. Because war has a way of burying its secrets, and some names, some call signs, are meant to stay buried until they're needed. The young private, Bennett, sometimes lingered near the clinic longer than he needed to. He was only 19, wide-eyed and eager, and unlike the others he saluted Elena every time he saw her, awkward but genuine. Once, he asked why she always checked the supply crates 3 times before signing them off. Elena smiled faintly and said, "Because once you miss the small things, the big things swallow you whole." He didn't understand it then, but he remembered her tone, the way her eyes never left the perimeter even when she spoke. Others missed those details, but not Bennett. He began to realize there was more to Elena Vargas than rolled-up sleeves and a battered medic's kit. Still, the whispers persisted. "She's not one of us. She hides in the clinic." She wouldn't last a minute outside the wire. Each word was a dismissal, each laugh a small stone on the pile of underestimation they stacked against her. But Elena carried them the way she carried everything else, silently, steadily, waiting. She wasn't there to prove anything to them. She was there to do her job. And yet, late at night, when the outpost quieted and the hum of the generators was the only sound, she would sit on the clinic cot, unwrap the bandana she used to tie her hair, and trace the edge of a scar on her left shoulder. That scar had earned her something they would never know. That scar had earned her a name whispered only in classified briefings. Tiger Wolf. She had never spoken it aloud since that night. She hoped she never would again. But war has a cruel way of circling back, of calling on people when they least expect it. So she patched up wounds. She endured the jokes. She kept walking the perimeter with her flashlight when no one else bothered. She checked the locks twice. She stayed awake longer than her body wanted. And she waited. Not for recognition, not for glory, but for the inevitable moment when silence would end, and the truth she carried would no longer stay buried. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be quiet anymore. It would roar. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of day that began with the sharp burn of desert air rising off the sand and ended with the sound of mortars tearing the night apart. Evening had come slow and heavy, the sky painted in bruised purples, the bass just settling into its rhythm. Soldiers finishing chow, radios buzzing, a patrol due back within the hour. Elena Vargas was in the clinic, head bent over a splint she was adjusting for a corporal who'd twisted his ankle on patrol. She taped it, neat and firm, checked the circulation, then sent him off with a tired but patient smile. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. But war doesn't wait for permission. It arrives uninvited, and that night it came without warning. The first mortar landed at the edge of the motor pool, a concussive roar that split the silence. The ground shook, metal screamed against metal, and the sky turned into a rain of dust and fire. Sirens blared, boots pounded against dirt, shouts cut through the chaos. Elena dropped what she was holding and ran outside, heart hammering but steps steady. The clinic rattled behind her as another shell slammed down, closer this time, showering the air with shrapnel. Soldiers scattered. Some dove for cover, others froze in shock. Radios crackled, but words tangled in static. The captain, a broad-shouldered man known for his steady presence, sprinted toward the command post, shouting orders. But he hadn't made it 3 steps before the blast hit. It wasn't direct, but close enough. The shock wave threw him forward, his helmet skidding across the dirt. When he rolled over, blood streaked his temple, his leg bent wrong. His voice faltered, thin and raw, and the command chain cracked. Men looked around in panic. Who was in charge? Who had the orders? The line between discipline and chaos is thin, and that night it began to split. Elena's instincts fired before thought. She was already moving, already sliding to the captain's side, already ripping her med kit open as dust and debris rained around them. Her hands were steady, quicker than fear, pressing gauze against his wound, checking his airway, scanning for fractures. "You're not dying on me," she murmured, her voice so firm it startled even herself. Around her, soldiers stumbled, firing blindly toward the tree line where muzzle flashes erupted. Screams cut through the air, 2 men down by the south fence, another pinned near the overturned Humvee. No clear orders, no coordination. The captain's lips moved, forming words through blood, but they dissolved into a groan. And then something happened, something no one expected. Elena looked up, just once, and shouted, not in panic but in command. "Cover the south fence. Pull the wounded behind the vehicles. You," she pointed at a stunned private, "grab the radio, keep trying for comms." Her tone cut like a blade through the haze of chaos. Soldiers hesitated, stunned. Who was she to be giving orders? She was the medic. She was Patch. But hesitation kills, and they knew it. A young private, the same Bennett who had once saluted her, snapped into motion, grabbing the radio and scrambling behind cover. Others, seeing movement, followed. Fire shifted. Lines reformed. For the first time since the blast began, chaos had a rhythm. But Elena wasn't done. She pressed a quick tourniquet on the captain's leg, then leaned low, her face inches from his. His eyes fluttered, trying to focus. He saw her, really saw her, not as the quiet medic, but as the only steady thing left standing. With blood on his lips and pain carved into his face, he rasped a command that froze every man within earshot. "Tiger Wolf, lead the evac." The words hung in the air, foreign and sharp, like a secret spoken too loud. Soldiers glanced at each other, confused. Tiger Wolf. No one knew that name. But Elena froze for only a heartbeat. Her jaw tightened, her eyes sharpened. She nodded once, a single acceptance. She stood. She wasn't asking anymore. Fall back in pairs, she shouted. Secure the wounded first, weapons covering. Move on my mark. There was no argument. Not now. Her voice carried authority that didn't need rank, and men obeyed before they even realized it. Elena darted forward, dragging one of the wounded by his vest, bullets snapping through the air around her. Another soldier moved to cover her. She hauled the man behind a supply truck, checked his bleeding, barked for another to hold pressure. Then she was moving again. Her steps were precise, her movements controlled, like she'd done this before, and she had. Years ago, in a place no one here would ever read about, she had led an evacuation under fire. That night, the call sign Tiger Wolf was carved into history. She never spoke of it. But now, forced into the light, she wore it again. The unit followed her. They dragged the injured, fired cover bursts, moved in controlled lines back toward the fallback point. It wasn't perfect, nothing in war is, but it was order where there had been chaos, a thread of survival pulled from the jaws of panic. The wounded cried out. Ammo belts rattled. Radios hissed. And through it all, Elena Vargas was the one voice steady enough to keep them moving. Left flank, shift fire. Keep moving. Don't stop. She dragged one man herself, fire cutting inches from her shoulder, her boots sinking into churned dirt. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, but she never slowed. By the time they reached the fallback zone, battered but intact, silence began to return. Shattered, uneven silence, the kind that follows survival. The last shots echoed into the night. The wounded lay in rows, breathing, bleeding, but alive. Soldiers slumped against walls, eyes wide, bodies shaking from adrenaline. They stared at her, some in disbelief, some in shame. She had done what none of them had. She had led, not just with commands, but with her own hands, her own strength, her own refusal to break. The captain, pale but conscious, was carried in last. He was breathing shallow, but his eyes locked on hers. A faint smile touched his lips, the kind a man gives when he knows he bet on the right card. Tiger Wolf, he whispered again, softer now. Soldiers heard it this time. They didn't understand it, not yet. But they understood something else. Elena Vargas was not just the medic. Not anymore. And in that silence, in the heavy air of a night they barely survived, respect began to shift. Not with applause, not with ceremony, but with the weight of realization. The woman they'd laughed at, the woman they'd dismissed, had just saved them all. Dawn came slow and gray, the kind of light that feels less like a sunrise and more like the sky itself was ashamed of what it had witnessed. The outpost was battered, sandbags torn open, walls charred, Humvees twisted like toys left in the hands of a cruel child. But it still stood. And more importantly, so did the soldiers. Some limped, some bled, all breathed. In the clinic, cots lined every corner, and Elena Vargas moved between them with the same quiet precision she always had, checking pulses, stitching wounds, adjusting IVs. To the casual eye, it looked no different than any other morning after an attack. But the men knew better. They watched her now not as background, not as patch, not as the girl with gauze, but as the one who had pulled them out of chaos and carried them to this fragile dawn. Whispers followed her, but not mocking ones. They repeated the name, uncertain at first, almost reverent, Tiger Wolf. It spread like smoke through the camp, a name none of them had heard before last night, a name that came with weight they didn't yet understand but instinctively respected. By noon, a convoy arrived. Among the arrivals was a major, stiff in his pressed uniform, carrying a leather folder tucked under one arm. He went straight to the command tent, where the battered captain lay propped on a cot, leg braced and bandaged, eyes heavy with pain, but still sharp. The soldiers lingered near the entrance, pretending to busy themselves, but their ears strained for any fragment of what was said. The major's voice carried. We confirmed it. She wasn't just a medic. Vargas, Tiger Wolf, she was the lead Evac officer in the Naram Pass extraction, 2019. 37 souls, 0 casualties. The doctrine you still train under, Captain? She wrote the procedures. Under fire. Silence followed. Not the silence of disbelief. The silence of shame. The silence of men who realized they had overlooked the very person who'd already written the blueprint for saving their lives. Later that afternoon, Elena stepped outside for the first real breath she'd taken since the attack. Her hands were raw, her fatigue stiff with dry blood that wasn't her own. She leaned against the side of the clinic, closing her eyes against the harsh desert glare. That's when she heard it. The sound of boots scuffing on gravel, deliberate, hesitant. She opened her eyes to find half a dozen soldiers standing there, shifting awkwardly, uncertain what to say. At last, Bennett, the youngest, stepped forward. His salute was sharp, precise, nothing awkward about it anymore. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady. "We're alive because of you." Elena looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head gently. "You're alive because you listened," she replied. But Bennett didn't lower his hand, and when the others followed, raising their own salutes, Elena felt something stir in her chest she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Not pride, not vindication, just the quiet weight of being seen. Word spread beyond the outpost. Within a week, new orders arrived. Elena Vargas was to remain in place as acting evacuation lead, her authority recognized not just by the wounded captain, but by the command structure above. It wasn't ceremony that announced it, just a posted order, stamped and signed, tacked to the bulletin board where every soldier could see. But the reaction was louder than any parade. No one joked anymore. No one called her Patch. They called her Ma'am. They called her Doc. They called her Tiger Wolf. And for the first time, they meant it with reverence. The captain recovered slowly, confined to crutches but clear-eyed when he approached her weeks later. He leaned on his good leg, looked her in the eye, and said simply, "I should have seen it sooner." Elena shook her head. "You saw it when it mattered," she replied. He nodded, the closest thing to an apology a man like him could offer, and for Elena, it was enough. But she didn't change. She still walked the perimeter at night with her flashlight. She still double-checked the locks, still counted every bandage and 4-line 3 times. The only difference was the way the others looked at her now. They watched her walk and straightened without meaning to. They heard her voice and listened without hesitation. Respect wasn't something she had asked for. It was something she had earned, in silence, in scars, in the unshakable steadiness of someone who didn't need to prove anything anymore. Months later, a transport brought in new recruits. They didn't know her. They saw only a medic, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back in the same messy bun, moving quietly through the clinic. But the veterans pulled them aside, lowering their voices, almost protective of the story they were about to share. "You see her," they whispered. "That's Tiger Wolf. She saved this whole unit. Don't mistake her quiet for weakness. When it counts, you follow her. No questions." And the recruits, still green, still unsure, nodded hard, understanding more from the weight of that name than from any formal briefing. Elena never bragged. She never told the story herself. When asked, she shrugged it off. "I was just doing my job," she said. But the men knew better. The name lived on, whispered in respect, etched into memory, carried like a shield against the forgetfulness that war so often breeds. Years later, when the outpost was decommissioned, when the walls came down and the sand reclaimed the ground, they left behind a small plaque bolted to the clinic's outer wall. It bore no rank, no long list of medals, just 3 words: Tiger Wolf led. And in the years that followed, when soldiers told stories of the night the outpost almost fell, they didn't talk about the mortars or the blood or even the captain's injury. They talked about the medic who became their leader, the woman who walked into the fire carrying nothing but a medical bag and a will that refused to break. They told it not with laughter but with reverence, their voices lowering when they spoke her name. Elena Vargas. Medic. Soldier. Leader. Tiger Wolf. Because sometimes, the fiercest warriors aren't the ones who shout the loudest or fire the biggest guns. Sometimes, they're the ones who wait, quietly, patiently, until the moment comes when everything is burning and everyone is looking for someone steady enough to follow. And when that moment came, she didn't just patch wounds. She carried an entire unit back into the light.